So some of you have already figured out that we're doing musical chairs at this point, but we'll have a minute to sort ourselves out. So sorry to interrupt all the good buzz, but just to get us going, this is the last session of the day, except for when we reconvene to report out into breakout groups. 4 groups. One group is 4 topics, and one topic is liability concerns from the standpoint of clinical investigators. Another topic is liability concerns from the standpoint of trial sponsors. And then there's sort of barriers and opportunities for evidence generation for people who are pregnant. And then the 4th group is for people who are lactating. So basically 2 liability groups, if you like, one focusing on sponsors, one focusing on investigators, and 2 sort of, what's standing in the way of evidence generation for pregnant people and for people who are lactating. If you're in the room, I can see people have already sorted themselves out, right? So there are 2 tables of each type in the room. If it looks like, one table has got too many people in it, please readjust so we have something like the same number of people in each group. If you are joining us virtually, then there will be an option to move to the breakout room of your choice. Okay, so you should be in the group you want to be in, and hopefully that works out well for everybody. The task is essentially the same for all the groups, right? You just have a different area to focus in. You've got 2 questions to address. The first is, for your topic, can you identify the main barriers, challenges, etc.? And then from within that area, see if you can identify 2 or 3 that should be a top priority because of a combination of 2 considerations: impact and likelihood of being able to make a difference in that area. So first task, and you're only supposed to spend about 10 minutes on this, is sort of what are some of the big challenges? Which of the challenges do you want to land on to focus for the rest of your small group, which is another 35 minutes? And there the task is pick challenges that you think are impactful, where if we could fix them, it would make a big difference, and that are tractable, where you see a pathway to making a difference. So that's our task, right? And with that, we will, you've got a moderator in each group who will report back, and we'll try to do this very efficiently when we return at 4:15. Is there anybody have any questions in your small group? There are worksheets available. Andrew, are we distributing the worksheets, or are people picking them up? Outside. Okay. Yeah, maybe easy just to bring some in. And for those of you who are joining us virtually, you will find in your materials that you were sent, you'll be able to find in kind of the briefing book, you'll find the guidance for the breakout groups. So with that, everybody have fun, and I'll see everyone at 4:15. So we will convene. We're reconvening. And the idea is that we'll have really quick reports from each of the groups. So just to orient people, we have 2 groups who took up liability concerns on the part of clinical investigators, one virtual and one in person. We have 2 groups that took up liability concerns from the standpoint of trial sponsors, one in person and one virtual. We have 3 groups who took up the question of evidence generation in pregnancy, 2 in the room and 1 virtual. And then we have 2 groups, 1 virtual and 1 in person, looking at evidence generation and lactation. So this is kind of like speed dating, right? We're supposed to have really quick reports from each of the groups. If you don't have any, if you follow another group, whoever you are for your group, and the other group has just said some of the things you wanted to say, just say ditto that, and we added, right, X, Y, and Z, so that we don't need to hear you reporting out twice. in the interest of engaging our virtual participants, I'm going to start each time with the virtual group rather than the in-person group because I think we're all more connected, physically and otherwise. I also want to say that there's actually a reception with food and drink open to everybody at 5 o'clock. So you have an incentive to get this done by 5. That is far more than just your good citizen incentive. It is that if we're prompt, we will go have a reception. And we're also fighting a storm, or at least a rain shower. So right now we're scheduled to be upstairs, outside, but if it rains, we will have to move. So another incentive to try to get the reception in before the storm. So with that, I'm going to call on the first group that met virtually on liability concerns from the standpoint of clinical investigators. I'm sorry, I don't know who you are.
I did.
I'm sorry, we're going to start with the virtual group first.
I'm the virtual group.
Oh, you're the virtual group?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. You look so real. Bill, you look so real. Okay.
I'm a hologram transmitted down from room 206. My name is Bill. I like dogs. I don't like rain and my wine at receptions. Oh, that was a speed dating part. Okay, so on the group 1 had obstetricians, pharmacologists, folks from FDA, NIH. We had attorneys. We had pediatricians who I was really happy about. So I had a really great conversation. We were talking about the concerns about inclusion of pregnant and lactating persons in clinical trials and potential solutions. And so the 3 we came up with is that one is that the inclusion of pregnant and lactating persons is not required. And so that often is a barrier for clinical investigators. And one of the solutions we talked about was applying some of the lessons that we learned from BCPA and PREA, that a balance of carrots and sticks is important, and sometimes the sticks work better than the carrots, depending on the circumstances. And that from the clinical investigators' perspective, and we didn't have sponsors in there, but their thoughts were that the sponsors would have cover because if they have to do it, then they have to do it. The second thing that was a potential barrier was the negative impact on the developing fetus or the child, including teratogenicity, but not limited to that, including lactation concerns. Really several really practical concerns that came out of that. One is using some central resource or resourcing IRBs with folks with obstetrics and pharmacokinetic and pediatric expertise so that IRBs wouldn't be sitting in isolation making these decisions. Research design, we talked about moving the needle. So research methodologies that moved us from 12 years post approval to someplace sooner than that. And because it wasn't so easy as to say, okay, let's move it into after phase 2 trials or move it right after marketing, because depending on the condition, the drug, the potential outcomes, the pharmacokinetics, the importance. So what we just said is that there are approaches that need to be considered. And then really being intentional and thoughtful about that, but also compiling data through registries and other large cohort studies. The final thing that has challenged investigators is that it costs too much to do that. So when it's done as an afterthought, there's not money set aside. So prioritizing that from NIH perspective as well as in terms of sponsors, and really, again, applying lessons learned from BCPA and PREA, where that's got to require partnership between FDA, between funders, between sponsors, between investigators, where they all are committing not to find the easiest loophole around labeling, but to really be thoughtful and do it with the intent that was designed around that. And that's my report.
Thank you. That's great. So now we have group 1 in person. I don't know who the leader is of that one. Okay, go ahead, Layla.
Okay, so we had mainly clinical investigators in this group. So we identified barriers on the side of the healthcare provider and then also on the side of the patient. So in terms of the healthcare provider or clinical investigator, lack of training. So OBGYNs are not trained in clinical research, so that's a huge barrier. Same issues that were identified in the prior group, so lack of funding and resources. So there was discussion related to funding cycles are too short. Those need to be extended. Academic investigators feel like they're constantly reapplying for funding and unable to complete their clinical research. Need for infrastructure. A lot of these studies are conducted in academic centers, and there's a real need to reach out to communities that are not usually represented. So these academic centers need to put in some efforts and resources to get out of their academic centers and go out into these communities that are not usually represented, sometimes rural communities, and to get those patients into their studies. Let's see. So on the patient side, there's interestingly a lot of misinformation that is these investigators have experienced on the side of patients. So, for example, misinformation that's propagated by influencers. So these are, people out there who are really famous, and maybe Nicki Minaj was mentioned. Okay. So trying to address all that misinformation that's being propagated to try to get patients into trials. Consent forms are too complicated, too long for patients to understand, too many barriers for patients in terms of requirements to go to investigator sites to get testing done, blood tests, ultrasound, et cetera. And so some of the potential solutions to address those were lessons learned from the COVID experience. So, for example, doing remote consents, Spanish language consents, electronic consents, and then broadening lab access. So allowing patients to go get their lab work done outside of the investigator system, allowing home health labs, so sending home healthcare workers out to labs to draw those labs from patients at their own home, or self-collecting samples, for example, nasal swabs. So allowing more flexibility in terms of trial design, sample collection, and also in terms of following up. So rather than having inpatient follow-up visits with the patients, doing virtual visits by Zoom calls, follow-up with texts, et cetera. And then in terms of addressing litigation issues, so the model that was discussed earlier by the model that's being used at University of Washington, so developing that into your institution and getting buy-in to address those liability issues, and then addressing liability with, there was discussion related to something similar to the vaccine compensation fund. So building on that model to also develop some kind of compensation fund for drugs that would include pregnant people in their trials, and then that subsequently get approved. And I think that's everything, unless anybody else in the group has anything else to contribute. Thanks.
I have one more issue that I'd like to bring, and that it's related to the consent process, which usually is an event. And sometimes when we do telemedicine or teleconsenting, we need to have, sometimes we have a conversation, and then the participant thinks about it and maybe finalize the process 2 days later. And we are required to have it described as it happened in one time or within 1 hour, whatever short time frame. But I think we need to rethink the consenting process as a process, and having a larger window for this process to take care. And then you document, you started the conversation on Friday afternoon at whatever time, and the participants sign on Sunday or Monday. So it's not, I think we're sometimes coercing people to sign quickly because that's what we are supposed to be doing. But I'm just thinking that maybe the consent process should have a larger window.
with that, we're going to move to the virtual group that focused on liability concerns for trial sponsors. But who is the reporter back? Sounds like it's somebody virtual. Do we have a way to get? Is Leslie on Zoom? Is that what we're? Should we move on? All right. While we try to work on that one, let's go to group 3, which is more broadly evidence generation in pregnancy, and start with whoever's reporting back for the virtual group. Is that you, Kavita? Okay, please go ahead.
Yes. So we had 2 questions. First was barriers or concerns, and then second, how to address them. So a lot of what we heard for the first one, we've heard today, so I won't repeat those. I think a few of the other additional concepts that came up that I wanted to highlight was to change the expectations so that some work be done prior to approval rather than waiting for approval, then a lag time, and then study in pregnancy, and then also how difficult it is to do an accurate risk assessment and get that information from the FDA when you're proposing NDAs. And then the third is that pregnancy itself is a very heterogeneous and not homogeneous condition, and to remember that there are subpopulations within pregnancy as well. In terms of how can these barriers be effectively addressed, we kind of bucketed the amazing feedback and conversation that we had in sort of 4 buckets. And it was it works sort of temporarily in terms of starting pre-study and then moving to post-study. So in pre-study, consideration bucket 1 was about education. So really mapping out the stakeholders and thinking of that in the broadest conception of that word in terms of not just the patient, her partner, her family, whole culture, her society, but also the legal regulatory aspects, and really be intentional about education. So education of why it's important to be in clinical trials, why and clinicians, why it's important to recruit, minimizing starting early in medical education and nursing education. And then 2, once you move past that education phase, is to start with early subpopulation studies to really look at PK data in pregnancy, and then once you're in phase 3, phase 4 work, minimize and reduce contraception requirements. So then you have that PK data for safety, but then you get the natural sort of population of people who become pregnant, and you can follow sort of HIV studies or pre-exposure prophylaxis studies in terms of how this was done well, and really broadly conceptualizing your outcomes longitudinally, including not just maternal health, but child health and neurodevelopmental outcomes as well. 3 was incentivization. So incentivize industry to do this like they did with pediatrics. An example was extend patents for 6 months, which was very popular and efficacious, whether it's monetary incentivization, reducing legal regulatory pathways, barriers. And then also remember to incentivize patients like we've heard today, as well as an interesting example of incentivizing payers also to be partners in this process. And then 4 was sort of the post-market aspect in terms of thinking about global no-fault compensation funds, a la the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program or other similar pathways for post-market help. Steve, did you have anything else to add? He was my co-moderator.
No, I'll say mostly ditto. I think the only thing I would add on, we had one interesting perspective because we had the benefit of a participant in the dial-in who was dialing in from Nigeria. And one of the points that she made to us about consent in particular was, and I think a little bit to the point that you were just making, Carmen, as well, is that consent can actually be a broader context in a different community. And so not thinking about, we tend to maybe think about it from our U.S.-focused individualistic perspective. I have the right to make a choice for myself. And in certain cultures, that choice is made in a broader context. And so just recognizing that and thinking about how that would fit into this context is important.
Thank you. This is great. Have we fixed the problem?
No, we're going to skip Leslie if she's not here. So just
Keep going. Okay, so apologies to the people who were in the virtual group on liability concerns for trial sponsors. We had a technical issue, right? And we won't be able to hear from those groups. So we're going to stay with this topic of evidence generation in pregnancy. We've heard from the report back from the one virtual group. We now have 2 in-person groups. I don't know where you are, but are you reporting back for your, please, go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Our group contained a good mix of stakeholders. We had folks from government, from industry, and from academia. And what we discussed was a general lack of standard around definitions of adverse outcomes or other conditions that are important to pregnant persons. So the ascertainment of those data are highly heterogeneous at present, and that's spread across real-world data sets, that's spread across prospective data capture, as well as within registries that may be required as part of risk evaluation and mitigation strategies. And so while there has been some work in developing standardized outcomes within other therapeutic areas or within specific diseases, there has not been work that has yet been published around developing these standards in pregnancy, though some groups are developing them. It's unclear to what extent the development work is complementary. So that was one cause for concern within the group. There was also a discussion about trying to make the list of these outcomes, if they can be standardized, fit for purpose with regards to trying to identify how real-world data sources could be used to compare between adverse outcomes within an observational set and within the population at large, so that difficulty of getting background rates for adverse outcomes of interest. We also discussed the need for process simplification to incentivize work to be done within with pregnant people and within the context of clinical trials. So IRB structure and approval being one of those core topics. The idea that while the single IRB mandate extends towards federally funded studies, local IRBs, for example, are not governed by that, and so there needs to be some IRB-wide policy that would allow for the inclusion of pregnant people as the default rather than the exclusion as the default and the inclusion requiring advanced justification. We further talked about the use of digital health technologies like registries, but allowing for more interaction with patients to be able to pull in the necessary data elements to make registry successful, as well as trying to identify ways that we can converge between labeling standards and the purview of regulators, as well as professional society guidelines that often dictate translation of insights to the point of care. So in terms of priorities for next steps, we discussed the immediate need to be able to work with IRBs and in the way that a previous group described to ensure that they have the appropriate diversity within the review board, but maybe in a more actionable sense to provide a redistribution of the case report form such that the opt-out format is used, wherein you must explain why you are not including pregnant people within the IRB application rather than providing the additional documentation as it currently is for positive inclusion. We talked about the need to simplify as well reporting platforms like clinicaltrials.gov, wherein there could be opportunities to allow for reporting of the number of pregnant people within these trials to better understand cohorts that could be available for data reuse, as well as clarifying the counts of participants between pregnant people and infants. And that hits at updating the U.S. Public Health Service Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Report to better clarify the number of pregnant persons and the number of infants corresponding to those pregnant persons in the context of any reported clinical study. We then discussed ways that we can promote harmonization. The consensus was that there is a need for definitions of concepts like preterm birth to be common among all parties that would use them, but with sufficient room to promote exploration of data harmonization, of data standardization work that has really not been well funded and is currently not existent at large. And so potentially using strict or quantitative standards, but with sufficient room for a Delphi process to allow for further designation of which of those standards is the most appropriate to use across the board downstream. And finally, we discussed the need for education, that clinicians should continue to receive training on the importance of including pregnant people within registries and within clinical trials, and that there may be opportunities to engage with professional boards to be able to promote education on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. So we should probably continue with the general territory, the Group 3 territory, but I see Leslie is here and can report back from the group. So we'll come to you after we finish this group. So who is reporting back on behalf of the second? Okay, please go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, so we have 8 group members representing academia, NIH, FDA, the scientific community, and other advocacy organizations. We identified 8 topics, and we talked in detail about 3, so I'll go through those. We likewise also talked about the IRB and have many points similar to yours, so I won't reiterate those. We talked about having a consent process that is more sort of user-friendly when discussing the study with the patients, having sort of a more user-friendly way to transmit the information to pregnant patients without all the legalese in a typical form. We talked about having a dedicated committee as part of the IRB that could be convened to review complex populations and would have dedicated, OB or MFM expertise. We talked about, and that would be like a special committee that would be constituted on demand. We talked about using pregnant person-centered language, enumerating pregnant and lactating persons as a population that's automatically considered for inclusion. And then there is a document that the FDA already has that outlines basic protections and study design considerations, and making people aware that this document exists, making IRBs aware that it exists as an existing resource, and creating further resources. So we look back at like how our IRB member is getting trained, and is there a way, a sort of universal way during IRB training that members could then become aware of these resources and be better trained to understand how to include pregnant people in research. We also talked about working with the FDA prior to submitting R01 grants to help get the study through the study section and the IRB more quickly, so sort of front-loading some of that work rather than back-loading it once there's concerns brought up by the IRB. And then we also talked about the importance, of the IRB. Really, like the regulations are very much necessary, but we also need to sort of not let them stifle potential for research and innovation as well. Okay, the second big thing we talked about was education of all stakeholders, which others have talked about as well. We identified multiple stakeholders. I'm going to skip the ones we've talked about already. Really, the big thing there was making people aware of clinical trials, both patients and providers, and like educating patients at routine visits about the utility of clinical trials. And that could be done by a healthcare provider that the patient trusts, so that way it kind of helps foster trust in research as well. We talked about opening the door for pre-IND meetings with the FDA, discussing opportunities for sponsors to discuss the trial with the FDA and come up with sort of trial design ideas as well for an educational piece. We talked about podcasts and social media as ways to educate the general public, researchers doing media interviews to build trust and awareness of studies in the community. And then we also talked about an educational piece of how to get more investigators actually running these types of trials. So building materials that would help investigators run trials, get funding, recruit patients, and potentially there's an opportunity for R25 programs that would allow folks to develop educational programs to kind of develop these materials for others through grant funding, and maybe even partnership with the NIHD to develop these programs as well. And maybe this would help also foster diversity amongst investigators, which is then going to help promote diversity in our clinical trials as well. And then, okay, the last big piece, last third thing was improving our trust between patients and investigators. And one of the ideas proposed was using trusted proxies like community-based organizations and clinicians to help build that trust. Setting up the consent process for success in an unhurried fashion, shared decision-making, having the investigators look like the population that's being consented, being addressed, and then the promise that the results of the study will be shared with the participant and the community at large where the research is taking place, letting patients know whether or when they'll be told if they were in the placebo arm, and then addressing any fears that the patient might have about legal implications. This one, we had a harder time figuring out how we would do this. So it was like if the study, for instance, addressed drug use during pregnancy or involved undocumented participants, how would we protect the patient in those situations, and potentially discussing with legal about ways to include certain protections in study protocols. Anything I missed?
Thank you. It's really great. Everybody's been very comprehensive, and we really, I don't know if we're capturing this, but I guess we are. So we have 3 more groups in like 15 minutes, all right? So how about, Leslie, if we bounce back to you for you were the virtual group. Yeah, you're good.
Perfect. Okay, great. So we had a terrific virtual group with several industry sponsors, a reproductive endocrinologist, an FDA representative, and a bioethics fellow at the NIH. So lots of terrific conversation. In terms of thinking through the barriers, much of what's already been said aligns with our thoughts. So that's the beauty of coming at this point in the feedback. But one thing related to regulatory ambiguity that wasn't discussed so much is the degree to which there's confusion even around terms like minimal risk. And that it's not simply about saying research should be done in this population unless it isn't justifiable. It's about explaining when it is justifiable. And so there needs to be more explanation about what minimal risk is. If it's what you expect in the daily life of the research participant, we have to think, what do you expect in the daily life of a fetus? And that may very well be different at different points in pregnancy, which Subpart B doesn't account for. So that was our conversation about regulatory ambiguity. The second barrier that we considered is what our group called sort of an outsized, non-specified liability, which is to say liability seems huge, and we talk about it as if it's huge. What we are failing to do frequently is break it down. So liability is different at different stages of pregnancy. Liability risk differs based on the phase of research and whether there has been prior non-human studies and the degree to which they were informative. Liability risk differs based on whether the drug is pregnancy specific or not. At least we think that the liability risk might differ there. And the liability risk differs depending on whether we're talking about research-related harms or post-market related harms. And again, that gets at the point from earlier that it's very hard to talk about lactation and pregnancy liability at the same time because the harms are very, very different. And the third barrier that we discussed is that sponsors lack the relevant legal information and expertise to shift gears. They are often relying on experience of rather traumatic events. So either thalidomide or DES and the long tail liability of multiple generations of potential claimants. So having information about how frequently long tail liability proves to be a problem for companies would be helpful. And it would also be helpful for them to learn more about the relevant risks for different kinds of research and different points in which the harm occurs. So the priorities for moving forward also align with a lot of what's been said. Education, again, was an important one to do that. A lot of research needs to be done about where the risk lies. Our group was skeptical about whether incentives are actually sufficient. I think somewhat like Bill's group, they thought there might be more need for a stick than a carrot in this particular space. They thought that the sponsors may view liability as outweighing almost any kind of incentive. So unless there is a stick requiring this kind of research, it might not be undertaken. And finally, that kind of a requirement would provide sponsors a cover to engage in this research. Otherwise, we're going to be looking at low-hanging fruit. And so to move beyond that, our group thought these other kinds of steps needed to be taken.
Thank you. Thank you. So now we have 2 groups left, both on the population of people who are lactating. I'm going to call on Diane first, who was reporting back on the virtual group, and then we'll have the report out from the
Great.
in-person group. Oh, I'm so sorry. I have it on. Okay, so there's two sessions left, both in lactation. Pardon? I'm sorry? Does that help? Oh, I'm so sorry. Then we have 3 groups left. Okay, so I'll come back to you and make sure we have time. All right, everybody be careful. We have 3 groups and 11 minutes. Okay, then let's go ahead. Just make sure we have time. Yep, sure. Go ahead, liability group 2. Yeah.
But
Please, apologies.
I'm getting the feeling that you want me to be quick. So I'll be fairly quick. So we had a very diverse group of people in our group, and we spent a lot of time talking around and back and forward and all the rest of it. But it sort of came together quite nicely at the end. We felt the biggest barriers was essentially litigation risk, reputation risk to the sponsor, inertia from leadership. You know, why do we want to do this? And also uncertainty around what data was sufficient to say that you could then go into women who are pregnant. We felt that the fundamental sort of solution to this, which is, it's very simple, but it's not probably easy to do, is that this needs to be the core mission of the sponsor. I mean, the sponsor needs to sit there and say, this is important, we're going to do it. And if the sponsor takes that decision, then actually most of the liability concerns are then just going to be managed, because this is the thing that we want to do. We talked also around incentives. We were very clear that those incentives would work for conditions that are specific to pregnancy, such as preeclampsia, preterm labor, and so on. But they probably wouldn't be very helpful for treatments that women are taking and then subsequently get pregnant. We also talked about protection. You know, sponsors at the moment, generally speaking, insure themselves. So no one will give us insurance for these things. And so any assistance that sponsors could have around protection from other organizations, I think would be greatly appreciated. And then the last piece that we felt would help is predictable and consistent guidance from our regulators. Consistent in the sense of same across the different divisions, predictable in the we did not think that the stick was a good idea. Maybe we had more industry people on our group than you did. But we're not quite certain what the stick would be, and how it could make any kind of sense. Anything else from the group?
Thank you, and thank you for being so concise. And clearly, it would be lovely to be able to follow through and see what the source of the disagreement is here, but we don't have time. So perhaps over cocktails, you can duke it out. All right, so we are going to go to lactation now, 2 groups. Diane, do you want to do your group, and then we'll
Great,
do
thank
the
you.
second group.
So Ruth and I had a very small but robust discussion. We had a veterinary pathologist who was also a mother. We had a pharmaceutical representative from the UK. We had an LPN who works for the Virginia Department of Health, and we had an OBGYN from the FDA. So 6 key points. 1, lactation is a totally different space than pregnancy. As Dr. Hale pointed out this morning, there's no comparison. So when we think about how we have to think about solutions in the space of lactation, it needs to be completely separated from pregnancy. We need to change the current paradigm in thinking about drugs and therapies, that babies who are breastfed are better off being breastfed than the paradigm that exists currently that is like, to be on the safe side, just stop breastfeeding. So no one's really accounting for the thinking about the risk of not breastfeeding for the lactating person and for that baby. There's actually lots of data on post-market drugs from a lot of the work that Dr. Hale has done. So when you think about that space, there are few drugs that we know that would always be bad. So things like genotoxic chemotherapy, radiation. We know that there's going to be a lot of categories of medication or therapies that would be totally fine, but we also know that there are categories that would likely need to have good studies done. So for example, drugs that are extremely lipophilic. So that being said, if there were new compounds that were being introduced, having lactating women or people included in phase 3 of the trials, and then we had some disagreement about how many would need to be included, how that should be done, but including them in those trials for any new to market compounds. And lastly, there are true equity issues in this space because for well-educated and well-resourced people, they will seek out different sources of information. If someone tells them, oh, stop breastfeeding because you're taking this medication, they'll do their own research and they'll make an informed choice. If they have an issue with milk supply, and their milk supply drops and someone says, well, just give the baby formula, they're going to seek out treatment options like illegally ordering a medication from another country. But for low-resourced families and for families of color, they often don't have those same opportunities. So then that presents some serious equity concerns when we think about moving the science in lactation and therapies forward. Thanks. Did I miss anything, Ruth?
No, I think you did great. Thank you, Diane. And then we have one more group. I'm not sure who the reporter is. Please go ahead.
Okay, so I'm the last group, so I'm going to go real quick. We basically had identified 2 primary subjects. One was patient-centered problems, and then the studies not being performed to a they just didn't know how to perform the studies as the researchers. So I said I was going to do this quickly. So the second part to that would be that the patients, to overcome the obstacles for patient-centeredness, there would need to be lactation support, appropriate compensation and incentives, conforming language for the layperson, and focusing on patient access to the studies themselves. On the practitioner and the researcher side, they would need to have comprehensive training programs on procedure and logistics, education on perceived benefit on performing the trials on lactating people, and primarily just training in general for both the patient side on the lactation and on scientific side to make sure that everyone is conforming to a set standard of care.
Thank you. Perfect. Okay. So at this point, before we adjourn and go somewhere for a reception, I guess Carolyn will tell us where it is. I'm to remind you my last task, and then you'll see more of Shirley. All right, here we go. So my last task, and you'll see more of Shirley tomorrow and less of me, is to remind everybody that we begin at 8:30 tomorrow morning. We hope all of you will show up as you did today, both virtually and in person, because it really is a great program tomorrow as well. And thank everybody for being so efficient in reporting back. I hope you enjoyed your small groups as much as I enjoyed mine. And with that, Carolyn, where are we going for the reception?
Okay, so the reception is going to be in the atrium space, which is on the 3rd floor. So we'll have staff stationed outside. You can either go up the stairs or you can take the elevator. Our bartender is getting ready, so he said there's no rush. But everything is set up. Right? There's plenty of food and drinks, so we welcome you all to join us upstairs. And thank you for coming today. We really appreciate everything you've
Let's thank our National Academy staff.